Welcome everyone to Table Talk. It's a reimagined series created by and for underrepresented communities. My name is Andy Engel. I'm senior programmer at Reimagine. For anyone who needs a visual description, I'm a white cisgender male, glasses, grayish hair, and I have an orange wall behind me. Here's the central question of Table Talk. What does it mean to live and die well, specifically among groups that have been historically marginalized, who experience obstacles to healthcare and death care? Our vision for Table Talk is that it becomes a regular booster shot of knowledge, empathy, cultural humility, and community. While these conversations are by and for underrepresented communities, everyone is invited to these spaces to witness, learn, and listen. You can view recordings of all Table Talks to date at letsreimagine.org /Table Talk. Tonight's event will be a 40-minute discussion with our esteemed speakers on the topic of grief and Indigenous communities, which will be followed by Q&A. The majority of us are zooming in from the United States, also known as Turtle Island by Native Americans and their allies. Please join me in acknowledging Indigenous communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. This land acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to begin the process of dismantling the ongoing legacies of colonialism. I'm in Lenapehoking, also known as New York City. I also must acknowledge that my colleague Atik Young, one of today's speakers, has communicated to me that land acknowledgements are meaningless platitudes. That may be so. As a non-native person, I will continue educating myself in order to transform what appears to be a gesture into meaningful action. And if you want to know about the territory where you're located, check out this link in the chat, and hopefully Zubin, you can put this in. It's native-land.ca. Next slide, please. I want to thank our 2021 sponsors. We cannot do this work without you. I especially want to highlight the John and Wauna Harmon Foundation for their support of Reimagine's Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiative, which makes Table Talk possible. I also want to thank Sage and Centerlink for helping to spread the word about these Table Talks this fall. And thank you especially to my colleague Zubin Desai, who's helping out on this Zoom call. Thank you, Zubin. Now we can get rid of our slides. And now I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers. Jeff Lujan descends from Atsehem and Manso people. He is a licensed clinical social worker and educator. He's worked with youth and adults in hospice, trauma-informed care, substance abuse counseling, and more. He has extensive experience in multicultural settings, including Hispanic, sexual minority, Asian, Pacific Islander, and Native American communities. He was formerly a high school teacher who was part of the revival of teaching and learning in Hawaiian. He is also a sacred tattoo artist. Atik Young descends from Henisaro Apache people. He is a consultant, a writer, and a musician. He has served as a health educator, prevention specialist, psychotherapist, mediator, and traditional healer, serving diverse populations. He has worked with the Office of Minority Health, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, US Department of Agriculture, Center for Disease Control, the American Red Cross, and many other organizations. He is the founder of the National Two-Spirit Society with chapters across the US and Canada. He is also the founder of Only One, a non-for-profit dedicated to addressing health disparity issues in Indigenous communities, and Kalmekatslan, a school specializing in Indigenous traditional medicine. Both Jeff and Atik, who I'm getting to know, are complex, fascinating people with a wicked sense of humor. They are healers using different modalities. They are both artists working in different media, and they are activists in pursuit of social justice. Yes, they're native and Two-Spirit. They're Chicano, descended from people south of the Rio Grande. And they are so much more than that. So thank you both for leading this conversation. So to start, Atik Patson and Jeff, grief is a unique experience, as we know, to every individual. So I want to ask each of you to provide your own definitions of grief, and then provide us with some stories that can illustrate that grief based on your own personal experiences. So I'll kick it off to you. Jeff, why don't you start?
You know, I was gonna let my elder go first.
Oh, then do that.
We have to do proper protocols. And I can chicken out a little bit too.
Okay, who you calling old, girl? Yeah, so just very briefly, I think when we talk about when we talk about grief, when I think about it, it is those things that we're emotionally attached to that we lose. So we typically think those of, I was telling my my sister today, they want me to talk about grief here. And I said, well, we have this whole historical grief that I could talk about. And then I get these people calling me because they lost their boyfriend, right? And so it's this whole gamut. But at the end of the day, it's not just the people in our lives that we lose. Sometimes it's our life, our lifestyle. Sometimes it's our health. Sometimes it's our job. There are a number of things that we're not even aware that we're attached to them and that they're meaningful to us. And so we lose them, and then we have that awareness, right? And we feel the pain of it. We feel the pain of that loss. For me, that's in essence what grief is. Like me.
Oh, wasu tiki kwensilu tsa lang haki now atsiheme now manso teheme nakino ni nawa ni masewali pampa ewahkino kowan Tlaxcala. So just wanted to introduce myself that way. And before we started, and no disrespect to the other formalities that we've done, but I remember a teaching from a mentor of mine, Frank Satie, and he always used to say, whenever you speak of things that are important, especially these kinds of things, it's always important. Just begin with those herbs, those sacred herbs, whether it's tobacco or cedar or sage or sweetgrass. I just did some smudge here. Because he says we want to make sure that what we say comes from here and not here, because that's where most of our problems begin. We're talking from here and not here. So as I think about grief, for me, in my work, especially as in hospice, is that grief is maybe a process. That's how I would define it. It's a process. That's something that we go through. It's a journey that we go through. And in that, there's physical, mental, emotional, spiritual changes that happen that cause us to fundamentally change the way that we are in the world. And it's always going to be transformative in that way. At least that's my experience. Whether we engage it in a proactive way, or we try to shove it down like holding a basketball underwater, or whatever the different resources that we might engage in, it changes us. That's, to me, the thing that grief is transformation. I don't know. It's kind of my Reader's Digest version of it.
Can you both now, thank you for both those definitions. Can both of you provide some illustrations from your own personal lives that relate back to that definition that you just provided?
Nipewa. I you know, we're all going through an adjustment period right now with COVID. And I'd like to use that sort of as a springboard to, because we're all feeling some grief from this. All of us, our lives have changed, and we're having to contend with, well, what does this mean for me? And the adjustments I and everyone else has to make around this. But I'm taken back to 30 years ago, a little longer than that, but at about 30 years ago, I started losing a lot of people to AIDS. And it got to a point where I was losing a friend a month. After I lost about 50 people, I stopped counting. That was very, very painful for me. But there's a point at which I remember at one point I got a postcard in the mail, and I'm sitting in my car reading it, and they're telling me another one of my friends died. And I cried. I sat there and I cried and shed some tears. And then pulled myself together and drove off. And then that was like all I had left, right? All these people have died. So many people are dying around me that I had enough resource to cry in the moment, and then just pick myself up, put another brick on that wall around my heart, and then just keep going. And then about 15 years ago, I fell in love, went into a relationship that was destined to end from the first day, but nonetheless, we do these things, right? And when that relationship ended, all the grief that I had been holding on to for almost 20 years now, 15, 20 years, of all these people that had been passing, it had all collected in my heart. And because I fell in love, it opened up that wall. And now I was very vulnerable. And so when that relationship ended, I almost didn't want to be here anymore. I almost didn't want to be here. And were it not for the friends that I have that came over, spent the night with me, held me through the night, I wouldn't be here. And so grief can be overwhelming. I mean, this was very, very painful for me. And I'm not just crying the love that I just lost, but I'm crying for all these people that I have lost over the course of, more than a decade now. It can be very heavy. It's very heavy. It's very difficult. It is a process and a transformation that we go through. But yeah, that's what comes to mind as you ask that question.
I don't know. I think that throughout my life, ever since I was little, I've always been, because I come from a large family, there's always been those that have passed around me. I remember one of the first most, I guess, personally, emotionally devastating events was when my Aunt Manoka, she passed when I was 10, and I was really close to her. She was my grandfather's sister, but that's kind of the first recollection of that grief. But particularly this transformation of grief into something that became medicine was occurred in this period between 2007, no, 2008 and 2009, right in there. And it started 2007, but during that time, there was a period of time where 15 people within my family, a circle of friends and family, passed away. And both of my grandfathers passed during that time, and my dad's second wife passed during that time. A number of my uncles passed during that time. Some very close friends of mine are living in Hawaii passed at that time. Number of mentors. And it got to the point where I had a friend who was working in hospice. He was a counselor. And I called him at first and said, hey, what the heck is this about? Why are they giving my auntie morphine? I thought that's only like when you're about to die, because I only knew about morphine's use from watching John Wayne movies, right? War movies. And because these deaths were happening so frequently, we just made a monthly coffee meetup just to talk about things. And he kind of helped me work through some things that I was facing as the next person. And then after this, the second grandfather of mine passed away, he asked me, he says, with all that you've been through, have you ever thought about maybe being a hospice counselor? And then the light went on. That this time that I had been through and all of these losses, instead of just being a crappy period of my life, that I leveraged that experience to help other people. He and I talked about it for a little while and took some more reflection, ceremony, and prayer to come to that conclusion. But it's definitely been of benefit for me, not only in the work that I do now to help other people, but the way that it's also helped me on my own journey. More recently, there was in 2014 another 5 people that between February and November that had passed, including my cousin, who I took care of while she was in the last stages of her life, dying from metastatic ovarian cancer. And again, it took its toll, this time in the form of blood clots. I developed blood clots in my leg and pulmonary emboli in both lungs. But again, it taught me about how it was really important, even though I had become, I guess, sophisticated up here and understanding now, having done all this work with hospice and understanding the dying process and what was going to happen for my cousin. But I hadn't become as sophisticated in how to handle what was going on in here. And that was another shift in which that grief taught me how to take care of myself better and gave me that life lesson. And so now that's something I also share with the people I work with, through my work at hospice.
That whole idea of how we contend with grief. I think that a lot of times in our families, what happens is, rather than admit that someone's dying when someone's very sick, there's a tendency to just go into a place of denial and to not deal with it. I think one of the first times that we fully addressed in our family this whole idea of someone dying was when my grandmother was sick, and she was old already. They decided not to treat her when she developed cancer. But I remember all of us going to visit her. She was living in Kansas, and my gay cousin was taking care of her. And she's laying in the bed, and we went to visit her, and I did something that we call a limpia, which is a cleansing. We had the whole family there, did a cleansing with flowers, used smoke, did this whole ritual. And we gave everyone, we held hands, and we held her hand, and we were in a circle, and we gave everybody an opportunity to say to her what they needed to say. And I remember she saying to me at one point, because my grandmother was a healer in her own right. She used to live in a barrio, in a small area, a very culturally intact area. And the people used to bring their babies, especially to come get healings from my grandma. And so while we're there doing this whole ceremony, she says to me, I used to take care of you when you were little, and now you're taking care of me. And so that was reassuring, that felt good, but at the same time was an opportunity for the family to say what they needed to say as an acknowledgement of this is the point when we need to say these things, so we don't carry this, because so often people carry anger or grief or unsaid things or whatever. They have some idea about what they've lost by losing someone and not communicating to them before they pass. So I imagine you come across a lot of this in your work.
Yeah, finding ways, one of the things that I really appreciate from, I guess, traditional ceremony and is that opportunity or the importance of being able to do something to move grief through you. That's what I hadn't been doing when I was taking care of my cousin. It was back to back with those 4 other friends that I had lost, starting in February, and lots of travel. But then for those last couple of months, just taking care of her, sitting with her, getting stuck up here and not processing it through here. So that grief got stuck in my body and manifested in stuck blood clots in my leg. I had a DVT that went from my ankle to my inner thigh, and then that was breaking up and putting pulmonary emboli in both lungs. And so in reflection in how I wasn't attending to that is that, so many people told me, it's like, just go to ceremony. You should just gotten a sweat for yourself or something like that, But where I was just focusing on taking care of her, right, in her home. I was just hoping that, somebody would come by and bring me a Starbucks coffee, because she just had terrible U-Ban. It wasn't even good coffee. But, I was just focused on those kind of day-to-day things. I wasn't taking care of myself. And what I've found is, or as I looked across different cultures that I had, been around, is that all of those ceremonies, those traditional ways, there's things that you say, there's things that you do, there's things that you smell, there's things that you hear, there's all the senses are involved. It's a whole being, a whole somatic process of moving that grief through your being instead of letting it get stuck inside of you. And it's from that experience, my own experience, and that gives me that opportunity to tell other people. I tell them, this is my soapbox, because I screwed up. I almost killed myself, not taking care of myself in this way. So I explained to them the importance of doing those things, tapping into those ceremonies, those processes, those rituals. And for some, it might even be just as simple as, while they're taking care of their loved one, going to get a pedicure once a week. Remember, this one lady asked me, she goes, how's that going to help my husband? I said, it's not going to do a darn thing for your husband. That's what our nurse is there for. But while she's there for that 1 hour, take care of your husband, go take care of yourself. And they're massaging your feet and putting the hot wax and all that kind of stuff. Just take care of yourself, because when you come home, the challenges are still going to be there. Still going to be there, but you're just taking the pressure cooker, the lid off the pressure cooker just a little bit, just so that you have that strength, for herself to move through it. But that's what I really come to appreciate. I know that the topic, as he was asking about what might be Indigenous ways of dealing with this, is that pretty consistently I see that, one, that grief is a transformative process, and that there's those ceremonies or rituals or whatever are there to help us move through it and to transform that grieving.
I spent, as you know, learning to be a curandero, a healer. I spent a lot of time with different traditional communities, and I get to see how these different communities deal with grief afterwards. And I think one of the things that's prevalent is sometimes people just aren't ready to let go. And I know that in the Lakota communities, one of the things that they do, and Foolscrow talks about this in his books, but what they'll do is something they call keeping of the spirit. So they keep some part of the person, their hair or something, their head. Oh no, that's the Aztecs, never mind. I'm joking. But they keep a part of the person and they put it on an altar. and they keep it on the altar for a year. And during the course of that time, they're to feed that spirit every single day. They have to pray to it. They have to talk to that spirit. They have to feed it. So this is a way, I think, a very sort of cultural way of giving yourself the time you need to let go. Because at the end of the year, then they do a huge big ceremony, and it's called the wiping of the tears, a big ceremony to finally let go of that person. And at that point, they have to let go. At that point, it's not, you can't hold on anymore. You have to say goodbye. And it's, as you say, it's the process they're going through, but sometimes for some people, it takes a little longer, and they need to feel a little more attached to the one they just lost. So, yeah.
I think that's one of the things that I share a lot with folks in hospice, is that there is no timeline. Some people are under a mistaken thought process, like, Kubler-Ross has all those stages of grief, and that it's a linear process and that it's finished. But one of the metaphors I use is, it's circular, but because they'll talk to me about, I thought I was done with that stage, and now I'm back in bargaining, or I'm back in anger, or I'm back in acceptance, or I'm back in shock, or those different stages. And they feel like they're not going anywhere. And so I use that metaphor of like a hawk rising on a thermal. As it continues to go up like this, it circles around. I said, if you're looking from above, from 10,000 feet up and looking over, it looks like that hawk is just spinning around in the same place, not going anywhere. I said, but if you look from the side, each time that hawk turns and goes over the same place, it's at a little higher elevation. And though it's covering the same ground, its perspective is greater. At 100 feet off the ground, maybe it can see a quarter mile, and then 300 feet, it's going to see 2 miles, and 1,000 feet in the air, it can see out a mile. And I said, that hawk keeps rising on that thermal. Looks like it's covering the same thing, but every time it's seeing a bigger piece of the territory. And then eventually that hawk finds out where it wants to go, where it needs to go to find that food. Then it'll take off in that direction. I said, I think that maybe sometimes our grief journey is like that. It feels like we're covering the same ground. If we're looking straight down, but looking from this way, every time it's a little bit different. And it's a process. And as we go through those same, or those similar feelings, or those similar stages, it's an artificial construct, right? Kubler-Ross just created a name for the stage, much more complex than that word. But as we go through some of those feelings again, I think our perspectives tend to change. We grow a little bit from it, and we see a little bit more of the world.
I had a chance to meet Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I was working for AIDS Medicine and Miracles. We used to put on an annual conference targeting people that were living with HIV. And this conference was a godsend to be in a room of like people experiencing the same thing. And there wasn't a lot of hope at that time. This is in the early 90s. And so people felt hopeless. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross comes and starts talking about this stuff. But I remember when we brought her in, I'm sitting in the room. I'm tired because I've organized a conference, but I'm sitting there and she starts talking about her whole process. And then I start nodding off, and I wake up and she's talking about spaceships and abductions and aliens and all this stuff. And I was like, what, where was it? It just sounded really crazy and out of context, right? But she had some crazy ideas, and she was going with them at this conference. But I just remember waking up from, nodding off and waking up, and she's off someplace else on a journey. I think she was talking about some experience she had, but be that as it may, it was kind of funny. She gave us something to hold on to, some words, some ideas to understand our grief, because we're all losing so many people at that time. And while we know now that, that's rather simplistic, it was something. Sometimes we just need something to hold on, a sort of, lifesaver, if you will, a raft to hold on to carry us through the grief.
I think those are helpful. You know, it's like a friend of mine who was, when he was training to be an EMT, they start you off, they tell you ABC, you know, airway, breathing, and circulation. And no matter what you see, you start off with that because it gets you moving. Because sometimes you can get frozen in that shock and not do anything. But at least if you do something, then it breaks you past that shock stage of immobility. And once you start doing something, then now you can continue to process. I think even just those ceremonies or those concepts help get us unstuck, because it can be. I mean, that's you know, that fight, flight. It's the freeze and hide that sometimes we get stuck into when we're so overwhelmed. There's nothing to push back against or no way to run from it. And then that's, you know, that kind of, I guess, mammalian behavior of when the threat is too great to fight against and too fast to run from, that we freeze. And sometimes emotionally we freeze and get stuck in those places. Yeah. So these things, these concepts, these ceremonies, these processes can help us get out of the freeze, start to move again. There's this beautiful ceremony this lady shared with me. She's Anishinaabe, but her husband was Mohawk, and they were talking about this concept that they have, or this teaching. One of the ways that they think about that, that death, they say that there's a spirit that was created to take life. And out of pity for that spirit, they say the Creator made him blind and deaf, so that he wouldn't have to see the pain that he caused, and he wouldn't have to hear the cries of the families. And that he carries this big club, and that symbolically in each of us there's a fire. And that when it was our time to go, the Creator would say, okay, that one's time, and he would come and knock that fire out. And they say in that way of, especially with older ones, or as we see somebody's fire getting small, like in those long houses, there's that one central fire. It says everybody gathers around it, and especially for those people that are close, that are really important to us, you know, our family, you know, like our moms or grandmas or those mentors of ours. That as that fire gets smaller, we're getting closer and closer to it, to absorb the last of that heat, because that fire was the thing that protected us from the darkness. That fire was the thing that nurtured us, that kept us warm, that made us feel safe. It was the thing that we gathered around. And they said, when that one comes to strike that fire out, all the ashes come over us. And the closer you are to the fire, the more you're covered with those ashes of grief. And they say those ashes cover your head, so that you can't think of anything without remembering that lost one. And those ashes get in our eyes, so that we no longer see the beauty in the world, and fills our eyes with tears. And the ashes get in our ears, so that we can't even hear the beautiful sound of birds or appreciate the laughter of children. And it says that we breathe it in, and it literally chokes us up and coats our tongues, so that food no longer tastes good. And say that ashes cover our heart, so that it feels heavy. We can't feel love. We don't feel anything. And it covers our hands. And so that everything we touch is a reminder of that loss. And they say it covers our legs, so that it feels numb, like we're not even walking on the earth. And they say if you look at somebody that's covered in those ashes, they look more like someone that's in the world of the dead than in the world of the living. And they use that as that metaphor of what grief feels like. And they do that wiping ceremony too. And as they wipe, when it's that time to wipe away those ashes of grief, they're actually saying those words. And we're wiping that from your mind. Remember those of us here in the world of the living, and they wipe the eyes so you can see the beauty that's here with us in the world of the living, and they wipe their ears so that you remember to listen to the beautiful sounds of the children laughing and the birds chirping. And they make a cup of water and you drink that so that food will taste good again. And they keep saying that, repeating, to be here with us in the world of the living. But I find that was such a beautiful way of, one, helping people to accept that this grief is going to change everything about their day-to-day experience, and that that's normal, right? Because I think that that's the other thing. People, especially in our modern fast-paced society, right? You know, it's like, oh, it's been a couple months. I should be able to go back to work and not worry about this anymore. But nah, it might not. Might take more than a couple months. It might take years. And the idea that honoring that there's a space in your heart that will never be filled. And that's good. That's okay, right? To honor the unique place that that person held, you know, in our life, and to say that that's okay. You know, it's that song when a friend of mine passed, her grandson composed this song, but he says, "There's an empty seat around that fireplace and that old teepee back home." You know, there's always going to be that empty seat.
I'm reminded of the time that the first person that I lost to AIDS was my best friend. And he had already attempted suicide twice because he was really sick and he wasn't doing well living with AIDS. And I remember he dropped me off because I was heading to the airport. He dropped me off and he said, bye. And that was it. I didn't know that he was waiting for me to leave, because the other times I had intervened to stop him from committing suicide. But he knew I was going to be gone now. I was going to be gone for a week. I was going to do work out in Florida. And I remember the moment that he died, and I'm in the middle of an interview with someone. There's a 2-hour difference, but in the moment that I'm sitting there interviewing someone and listening to that story, it's like all the sounds around me, because we all have, we hear these sounds constantly, and we just take them for granted. But imagine if this hole above you is created where there's no sound, where there's just an emptiness. And that emptiness just comes down and touches you and it goes back up. This makes no sense in science. This makes no sense in the Western world. But in that moment, my friend died. And I knew that. I get back home and I get back to the hotel, and there's a note there and says, at this time he died. And given the time difference, I knew that it was in that moment. So we came back home, and so he dies on Thursday. Saturday, my boss dies at AIDS Medicine and Miracles. And then Tuesday, someone else I know dies. And then Wednesday's a funeral, and 3 people in 1 week. And I'm trying to hold it all in. But there's a point at which, after all this death, there's a point at which I'm sitting there on my bed, in my bedroom, looking at the door into my bedroom, really, really feeling the grief of Jerry's absence. And I started sort of checking off all these people that were important to my life and saying, well, they wouldn't mind if I was gone. Oh, they'd be okay. And I started checking off all these people, and I realized what I was doing is going down this hole, that my grief was so profound. I'm going down this hole and giving myself permission to take my life. And when I realized what was happening, I said, oh no, that's not good. I grabbed the phone and I started calling everybody I knew. And wouldn't you know, nobody's around and nobody's picking up. But finally someone answers, and it's not even like a good friend. It's we both knew Jerry, and he was just someone that I knew. But I called him and I said, hey, what are you doing? Would you like to go out and get something to eat? And he was shocked by this invitation. But I called him because he doesn't realize it. He saved my life. He became the anchor that I needed to stay in this world, by just going out and grabbing a meal with him and doing something different. So as you said, this process that we have to go through to move, to get away, to get out of this spiral, this downward spiral, to move me forward. I knew what was happening. I could reason all this out. I knew exactly what was going on. And I knew that I had to get out of it. And so that's what I did. But that was the beginning. That was just the first big death. And then after that, death after death after death every month. So yeah, it's impactful and it's heavy. And the rituals and ceremonies that we do, the purpose is to pull us through and anchor us in this world of being alive, right? So that we don't get carried off. You know, for Apache and Navajo people, there's this fear. You don't want to be in the same room when someone dies, because their spirit leaves, and when their spirit leaves, it can take you with them. It can make you sick. And so, and in the old days, what they do, if someone died, the little space they died in, their hogan or their house or whatever it was, they just lock it up, burn it down, and that was it. It's like you didn't want to deal with death. You know, for Apache and Navajo people, it's like, we don't want to deal with death at all. We'll just leave it alone. And it's because there's an awareness there, I think, of how profoundly we can be pulled toward that if we don't anchor ourselves here. And that was one of their big fears. So
yeah, I see that in a lot of traditions, that awareness, that during that time when that doorway is open and someone is moving through, that it's easy to follow. And I see it a lot in my work and hospice. I mean, it's not uncommon, especially for people that have been married for 40, 50, 60 years, that shortly after one goes, the other one goes. And it's and in retrospect, when I was telling you about my own, when I got those blood clots with my cousin was my best friend. She and I were like this since little kids. And she was my best friend my whole life, moving around the world and all the different things I'd done. She was my constant. And so when she left, I mean, that was a heavy, heavy grief, even just the process of being with her up until that moment. So when I came back from her funeral, that's when they figured out I had those blood clots. But it was like that door had opened, and my grief was right there. I was, as she step by step, which was an eye opener for me, because I'd already been doing hospice for 6-7 years at that time. I thought I was pretty sophisticated at this stuff, and I still had lots to learn. But so that's something that I know for me, that I bring awareness to the people that I'm working with, is being very conscious, especially for the caregivers, of helping them to connect and asking them before that time, who's your support system when this day comes? Who are you going to call? Who's that person that no matter how late it is at night, that when you pick up the phone, they're going to answer? And talk to them. Help them to know that that's going to come, that you may call them that way. So that when they see the number, that they do pick up, that you're going to need it. But helping them to start to connect with that in a very tangible way, and even sometimes facilitating those conversations, and say, okay, yeah, she talked to you, right? About this. And then for them to hear that person tell me, confirm, yeah, I'm there. They can call me. I'm going to be there. I'll pick up that phone. I'll come over for a visit or whatever it is. But that's, part of those traditional ways, right? The other thing that's interesting, I think as I was thinking about, I was telling Andy even that the title of this talk, Indigenous ways or Native American ways, that kind of thing. It's like, wow, feel kind of want to put a disclosure out there. There's there's over 500 federally recognized communities, and even with any individual community, there's no agreement within any one community of what is the best way or the appropriate way or the traditional way of dealing with, with the end of life and all of that, for certain. So these are just some things I picked up in my journey along the way. But one of the things that I appreciate is that that there's this idea that it's not final in a certain way, that the spirit continues, and that those spirits are here, they visit us. So there's this, when I was in Hawaii, there's this old chant, this old poem that talks about this phenomenon that happens. But it talks about a number of different things. But there's a particular thing that is talked about in this chant. That there's this phenomenon that happens right as the sun is rising or setting, because the light of the sun has to be coming parallel to the ocean. You have to be at the ocean when this happens. And then as the waves hit the rocks and that mist comes up, sometimes when the light is just right, that light lights up the mist, and it's this red mist that comes up. Sometimes they'll call that ehukai. And when I was talking to one of my mentors, Erika Anana, he was telling me, he says, that is the metaphor for us. He says that mist is a part of the ocean, and for a moment, we can see the light of the sun in a different way. And he says, sometimes it's just a brief moment and it settles back into the ocean right away. And sometimes it lingers for a few seconds before it returns. He says, but it always returns, and the light always continues. He says, that's us. He says, for a moment, this earth rises up to allow our spirit to be seen and experienced by the rest of us. But at some point, our body returns to the earth and our spirit continues on. Just we don't see it in the same way. And in a lot of, like in Hawaiian tradition, they have this concept of aumakua, these ancestral guardians that will come back to visit the people. Before they pass, usually they'll tell their descendants, oh, look for me in this way. I'm going to come to you in this kind of a manifestation, a certain bird or a particular shark that will behave in a certain way, or kind of a rainbow, or a cloud that has a certain shape or color. That's how you're going to know it's me. Not just any cloud, any shark, any bird, a very specific one, right? And that within other traditions, especially desert traditions, that sometimes when that life-giving rain comes, or that light first snow comes, those are our ancestors visiting us because they're bringing us that life. Or that, the ancestors will be seen in different ways. That the idea that those that have passed are always around us. And that maybe is to bring some comfort or remind us to pay attention so that we can, hear them in the wind or whatever. We see them, those birds are playing. But that's another thing I think that's maybe a little bit different in the way that, my experience of a lot of Native traditions is that when those that go on die, it's not like they go away forever. And then even within, in the Southwest and down in Mexico around in the Micailhuitl, right, the Day of the Dead, that, in Jemez Pueblo all the way down to the Zacatecas to Mexico City to Michoacan, on that day, people go to the cemeteries and they feast with those that have gone on. And they bring out all the chismosa and gossip, and everyone gets to hear all this stuff because, grandma, grandpa want to know everything that happened with, they catch everybody up. But that concept, that reassuring concept that those ones that are past are just, we don't see them with our eyes, maybe. Some of those that are gifted can.
One of my teachers at Los Xochitl down in Mexico, we celebrated Dia de los Muertos, but it wasn't a day. We started setting up on a Thursday, and we this went on for several days. We set up this huge altar on the ground, right? And on this altar, we set 5 fires, one in the center and one for each direction. And it was our charge to assure that those fires never went out. So the group of us that were there, 24/7 during this time frame, or 24/5. It lasted 5 days. We watched those fires and we kept them. We kept shifts and we watched over them. But during that time, they also had people coming and dancing. Some came and did theater. Some came and did some singing. Some told poetry. But my teacher told stories, and she told a lot of stories around this relationship to death that we have. But I remember her saying a couple of things. And one of them, she says, she says, in the old days, there were 3 ways they would bury people. She says, when someone was really, really good, they'd bury them in these huge earthen jars. And they'd put them in these jars and bury them because then their body would decompose very slowly. And all that goodness that they were, that we knew them for, would continue to come up and sort of bless the people with it, and that goodness would continue. She said, for most people who were just average people, she said, they would just wrap them in these grass mats. Yeah, the grass mats. They'd wrap them in the grass mats and they would just bury them like that. And they would just decompose at a regular pace. But there were some people that weren't necessarily so good. And those people, what they would do is they cremate them. And they cremate them so that negative energy wouldn't continue to live in this world. But as she's talking about that, she said, when we think about people, when someone dies, when they pass, she says, we don't need to concern ourselves with how we feel about them or any judgment or anything. She says, for all the good things that they have done in their life, they were blessed and they got those blessings. And for all the things that they did that were transgressions against others, they also had to live with those, and they were punished, if you will, by those right here on earth. So by the time that they die and they cross over into the spirit world, into Mictlan, that they crossed with a clean slate, that they were good, and as they crossed over, they were the same as anyone else that crossed over. So their spirit was light. And the good thing about that is so that we don't have to worry or judge someone for how they lived, for what they did, that we don't need to carry that we can just be happy for them, that they were here, that they lived, and let them go on to the spirit world in a good way. And then at the end of, every year for Dia de los Muertos, it's actually 2 days. Or in the case the way we did it, that you can serve up all this food, cook all this food, make this huge altar, and put all the things, of cigarettes, beer, whatever they liked in their life, you can put it on the altar. And she said that on those days, they come back from the spirit world. And when they come back, they come to the altar and they're like overjoyed to see that they were remembered and all this food is there. And then when they go back to the spirit world, they take the essence of that with them and they can share it with all the other people that were there. That there's some people that aren't remembered anymore and they can share it with them too. And so that's why we put up the altar, so that they know that they're remembered, and they go back and they're rich because they're loved and they're remembered. And so that's why we do these days. And it also gives us a sense of peace, of knowing we're still connected with them, we're still feeding them, we're still taking care of them. So these were some of the teachings that we got from El Osochit when we were down there and doing the ceremonies. And so that's a nice way to think about it, and not just to have to carry the grief and the sadness, but also the happiness and the joy that they were in our lives.
Atik Patson and Jeff, you two are doing such a wonderful job, and I could let you keep going and going and going. But I also want to leave some time for folks here in our group to ask you questions. And I want to invite everyone, if they wish, you can either put them in the chat, but we're going to open up the audio, and if folks want to ask questions. And I do want to acknowledge a Reimagine colleague and collaborator who's with us now, Yvonne Brock, who has hosted community events at Reimagine. Welcome, Yvonne. And I was wondering if you have any questions for Jeff or Atik Patson, I invite you to ask them.
Thank you. Thank you for your teachings, Atik Patson and Jeff. Greetings from Ohlone Land. I do, and this is a personal one. My daughter, who is 17, she recently experienced her ex-boyfriend dying of suicide. And the first thing that came to, she also has a couple of mental health challenges. before that, and then they got exasperated because of this passing. And the first thing that I thought of was, traditional healing. So we went to a medicine man and did ceremony there. And he had instructed her to, one of the things to do afterwards, he gifted her tobacco and said to put food out for him. And she could not do that. And then also, which I understand, and also in curandera, we had a curandera do limpia as well. And I mean, it felt good to her to connect culturally, but it didn't really feed her soul, let's say. And I'm just, if you can offer any gifts in terms of, as a mother, how to support her through this grief process. Thank you.
You know what, there are two things that come to mind for me. And one is, it's important to remember that the grieving process is very individualistic. And the question to ask your daughter is, what would you like to do? And use it in this way, frame it in this way. What would you like to do to remember this person that you love so much? This person, whatever the person's name is. What would you like to do to remember them? And you're going to use the word remember rather than say goodbye, right? What would you like to do to remember them? How would you like to honor them? And let her come up with the ceremony that she needs and just make it happen, right? She may not feel enough of a connection to a medicine man or a curandera to help her. The others, it's probably still really fresh in her heart and she's suffering from it. So I would say the process, when she's ready for the process, then you do what she needs to do. And maybe there's something special. Maybe it's write something on a paper and burn it, or whatever she needs to do, that let her come up with a way to do that, or where she needs to go. If there's some place special she needs to visit, let it be important and meaningful for her. That's one. The second part that is a caution, and this caution is when this happens, and when I felt like the door was open and that suicide was a viable option for me. Therapy is not going to help. Drugs are not going to help. There's one thing that will help. Just hold them. Just hold that individual. Just hold your daughter. And maybe she doesn't want you to hold her, but someone needs to hold her, and just hold her. And as she's crying, and there's nothing you can do, there's nothing you could say, so let that go. Just hold her and anchor her back into this world. That's about all you can do in my experience. All the rest of the stuff is stuff we get caught up in our heads in. At the end of the day, it's hold that person and keep them here. And then when they're ready, a ceremony that's meaningful for them to say their goodbyes. That's what they're going to do. That's not the language you would use, but that's what you're going to do. So.
Thank you.
Whitney?
Yeah, that it's interesting that my brother here was talking about not goodbye, which is really important because most Indigenous languages don't have a word for goodbye in the way that we conceive of it. But one of the things, in those, for her to share those thoughts with him, there's this process that comes out of work by a guy named Ira Bach, but I use it, we call it the 5 conversations. And so it's those things that matter the most that need to be said. But they're, please forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, I love you. Those 4 conversations bring things up to date, brings a relationship up to date. They may have had plans to go to Disneyland together, right? And we didn't get to go, but you can let those things go. But especially when someone goes suddenly and we don't have that opportunity to ask for forgiveness or give forgiveness, those are the things that can roll around in your heart for decades. My father was in the military. He was killed in El Salvador when I was right after I turned 18. And because I was at that stage in my life, hard-headed 18-year-old butting heads with him, I'm gonna move out on my own, I don't need you, that kind of thing. Then all of a sudden, he's taken. And I never had the opportunity to say those things. That took years before I figured that out. And then I learned this process. We use this in now with when I'm up doing my work up in Canada with people that are grieving, as we do a lodge. We do four rounds, and they'll come in. We have them bring in tobacco ties, right? One white, one black. The white representing the spirit, the black representing that body. So you're appreciating both. And then each round is dedicated to one of those conversations. So the first round, please forgive me, and then to express that. And the second round, I forgive you for all those things that, to let that spirit know, like, yeah, I was mad at you that time, you were going to take me to the movies and you didn't, whatever, those things that sometimes happen between boyfriend and girlfriend, right? And like, oh no, he passed away and I was mad about that. She may be still feeling some of that. Sometimes we do. When someone goes suddenly, it's like, that petty thing that was in between, that can really hold some heaviness. So I forgive you. And then thank you. That one round for giving gratitude for all those things. And then I love you. And then the last one is when we come out after that fourth round, is they take those bundles and they give them to the fire. And the last conversation is Dr. Ira Bach talks about goodbye, but I think of it in a different way, not a dismissal. One of the times when I was going down to the Kickapoo Nation School, because I was doing an in-service for the teachers there, because there's a lot of kids that had become like this dominoes of suicides. And so I was trying to think of how to provide in-service to the teachers to support them in working with these young people that were left behind, after their friends or relatives had passed in that way. And so I was thinking about, how do we do this in a culturally relevant way? And I looked into the English etymology of the word goodbye. And one of the sources that I saw, one that I like to hang on to, was that back in the 1300s, when one of the plagues was going through Europe and all these people were dying, that the Pope made an edict that upon departure, all good Christians should give a blessing to each other, right? And remnants of that persist in some of the Romance languages. In French, they say adieu until God. In Spanish, we say adios or vaya con Dios, right? In English, they said it used to be God be with ye. And over time, in the convention of writing of English using contractions that they started to put at the end of letters, God be apostrophe ye, God be with ye. Goodbye became goodbye. Initially, it wasn't a dismissal, it was a blessing. That's the final conversation. That blessing that I don't know what, even now I share this with the people that I deal with in hospice, right? And to facilitate these conversations while their loved one's still here with us, it's tends to be more mutually reciprocal and healing that way. But even when they're not, with a family that was a young mother, she had 3 girls from age 6 to 15. And then afterwards, especially the teenagers, they really went through some anger because their mom, part of how they felt was that their mom is abandoning them. They were angry about that, but then they were also feeling guilty, right? Because their mom died, but then they're angry and they're beating themselves up for feeling guilty. So we facilitated this little ceremony, and we had each of them write a letter, right? All of those 5 conversations, one letter at a time, just each one like that. And then the youngest one, the little 6-year-old, she did 5 pictures representing those conversations. And then with her dad, they went out in the backyard because they had a yard with a little stream next to it. They lit a fire. And then each of them, including the father, read those letters. And as they read each letter, they put it into the fire. And then the little girl, the youngest, as she described that picture, what the picture meant to her, she put it into the fire. And then they took the ashes from that fire afterwards and they put it in the stream and let it go. It's just a way to facilitate that. So in whatever way she finds that way to say, it's maybe not goodbye. Maybe it's that blessing. That I don't know what happened, but wherever you're at, whatever state of being you are, ask those that the universe looks after you. You know, and that's something I share with people to keep those conversations current with anybody that's important in your life, right? Because we never know, right? I mean, I could drive out on Academy Boulevard here in Colorado Springs and crazy drivers, man, somebody gonna run a red light and smash me. But at least if I keep those conversations current with all the people I care about, then they or I won't have that regret of not having said those important things that matter the most.
Thank you, Latsukamati Amateo.
Ashton.
You've shared so much wisdom on responses to grief personally, but I do want to ask both of you about collective grief. There is this holiday approaching, and I would love to hear from you how currently and in the past you've navigated that type of grief.
You know, one of the things that we have to acknowledge, and I can speak for, you know, sort of this general broad strokes kind of thing about the indigenous communities here in the Americas, but we have to acknowledge that it isn't particular just to the Americas. The colonization has happened around the world, and a lot of people over the last 500 years have experienced much the same. The genocide, you know, the community that I come from, the reason we're called Genizaros, it's a term that was given to us. The Spaniards, in all their wisdom, decided to create well over 25 different castes or categorizations. They're categorizations of race is what they are. But one of them was the Genizaro, and these are indigenous people that were taken out of their homes. They were stolen, captured, sold in the slave markets, and enslaved. As they become adults, then they're released, right? So my ancestors were slaves, but my ancestors were also slave owners. So there's that mix of both. And all of that's all through the Southwest here in New Mexico and down into Mexico. That's what they introduced when they came up and colonized this area. And so there's a lot of grief around losing your children, losing your family, being enslaved, having your life taken away, and then the deaths that happen around those. And then the second colonization comes in from the English speakers, and we now have to contend with the massacres that happened, right? The genocide. And so there's a lot of grief there. This is historical, it's in our DNA. And so when we see some things like police using dogs on us, or are people getting shot in the streets just because of the color of their skin, when we see these things, all that brings it back up. When we're having to lock ourselves in our homes because of COVID, this is a reminder of all the diseases that were brought over before, where somewhere between 80 to 90% of our populations died, but 10% survived. And we are those 10% that survived, the descendants of those. So there's a lot of grief there about a lot of things, right? And the injustices that continue. When we contend with racism, we contend with the lateral violence within our indigenous communities. When we have all these things that we have to contend with, then when something happens, it's a reintroduction or a reminder or a trigger for that grief that always lives there. And it's heavy grief, it's heavy grief. But we need to remember also that in addition to our grief and our suffering, we've also survived. And that survival is what we have to hold on to and say, we've been resilient and we can do this. We can push through this and we'll be okay. And our ceremonies help us to do that. So, Noitni?
Something that David had shared earlier about just holding on to someone, right? You know, hugging them through that grief. In the conversation that he and I had some time ago, he talked about that healing happens within the context of community. And maybe that through this, you know, in gatherings or community, to share these 5 conversations, if nothing else, right? You know, it's powerful. It can really be powerful. I mean, I've seen amazing things happen within families. It's interesting because it tends to be automatically reflexive, right? Somebody's telling you, hey, you know, I'm really sorry about whatever I did. You know, it's hard for you to be involved in something and hear that and not think about like, yeah, I was a little bit of a shit on that one too. So maybe I added to it, right? And not for, so even if it doesn't come out, it's happening inside. But that communal process of that doing something together, or if you're remembering those that have gone on within your circle, if it's a circle of friends or family and you've lost people during this time of COVID, communally doing that and sharing those things that you want to say to those people. Now, one thing that else I've learned from my brother is that can't put time limits on these kinds of processes. So it's not like, okay, well, we're going to eat in 15 minutes. So everybody go around the table and do the 5 conversations. There's lots that have to come out, right? Sometimes, and it's not gonna, you're not gonna be able to get it done in 15 minutes. So it's creating space and time to let those things come up, because especially when you go through these ones, or you're going through that, you want to facilitate that grieving. You want to allow those space to have those tears come. We do a ceremony at this up in Canada around grieving, in which each person comes and they bring those bundles, and we ask them to have those conversations with it during one round where the men are singing, and then one by one they come up to us and they offer it to us, and we just ask what's their. They'll say, "Oh, this is from my cousin, and she was really wonderful." Blah blah blah. Say all this stuff, and then I'll say, "What was her name?" Many times when the name is spoken, then the tears come, because they need that release. It becomes a way for the whole community to share. And there's, I guess, community permission for the grief, for the tears. That needs to be that safe place, right? And if we can create that safe place where the community comes, you know, every year we do this at the Sundance, and everyone's coming in, bringing those cloths for those ones that have passed, and everybody grieves together, and it's powerful. Some people think like, God, isn't that depressing? You know, but it's healing. It's really healing. You know, as all those tears come, it heals, and everybody's, you know, supportive of each other, and it's yeah, that, I mean, I don't know if that helps, but that's something I think about as a format.
You know, my GS says that we hold these emotions inside and they become toxic. When we cry, we release them, and there's some science to that now. And so as we release that, then we don't have to carry it anymore. And the other thing I would say about being in a group and people crying is that, you know, we have to check ourselves. There's nothing you need to do. When someone's crying, there's nothing you need to do. Just let them cry. And if they feel comfortable with you holding them, you can hold them. If you feel comfortable holding each other, or if you need to be held, reach out to someone. But people's tendency is twofold. One is, oh, I want to stop them from crying, so I want to do something for them. And the other is, I really feel uncomfortable right now, right? We need to check ourselves and just be. just be present. There's nothing we need to do. So yeah.
Mhm.
Folks, it's 9:15. I want to honor the time we have, but I don't want to say goodbye. I want to say vaya con Dios. I want to say God bless both of you, Jeff and Atikpatsin. Thank you all for joining us this evening. This was very special. I'm so full of gratitude for both of you. Thank you so much. What else can I say? If you're curious about learning more about Table Talk, we have the recordings on a page that we have that I can put in the chat. It's letsreimagine.org. Table Talk. This recording will eventually go up there, and it will also go to our Vimeo library, and we'll be sending it out to all of you as a follow-up so you can share it with your loved ones. And what else? Yeah, that's it. Atikpatsin and Jeff, do you want to have any last words for all of us?
Just thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
I wish you all well. The good spirits travel with you. Always walk with you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.